Hello, my name is Dr. David Rivera, and I'm a National Advisor with the Steve Fund. Welcome to our Young, Gifted, and Well webinar series. Today's webinar is called The Impact of Macro and Microaggressions on Students of Color. And I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Sherry Molock, who's an expert in mental health wellness for students of color. After today's webinar, you'll be able to articulate the impact of macroaggressions on students of color, articulate the impact of microaggressions on students of color, and define and understand the difference between macro and microaggressions. Sherry, as we start out our conversation, I thought it would be great to frame our work and our conversation in the ecological perspective. The ecological model we're borrowing from Urie Bronfenbrenner, whose theory spoke about how the climates that people are embedded in impact their psychological well-being and also their development. And so it's a reciprocal relationship between the individual and the environments that they're embedded in. And so Sherry and I are going to kind of conceptualize this via four spheres, where we start with the larger public, social atmosphere, going into the community that the institution is embedded in, and then thinking about the institution and what are those dynamics and how do the institutions create climates that impact students, and then what are the students experiencing. So really thinking about this reciprocal process between the individual and the various environments that they're embedded in and the issues that can then transpire to impact the wellness of students of color. As we kind of start out, Sherry, would you mind defining macroaggressions for us?
Sure. So macroaggressions are systemic and institutionalized forms of bias and oppression that impact the lives of entire groups of people. I think one of the things that people often struggle with is it's very easy to look at racism and discrimination and sexism and heterosexism on an individual level. Mm-hmm. And part of what that does is it creates a fallacy that we're not responsible for these larger systemic problems that impact students as well. And so it sort of makes it, I think, the fallacy of thinking it's a more easily manageable problem if we're just focusing on the individual level.
Yeah, now that's a great insight and something that we should be taking to heart. Especially because we often do get caught up on that individual level of interaction and those expressions of bias without kind of realizing that those were normed by the communities and the society that we're embedded in. Yeah. And every day we're receiving messages from all these different spheres, from the political sphere, from the social sphere, and from those institutional policies and procedures and programs that kind of impact how students understand their place in that institution and in the world around them.
I think the other thing that's really important for people to understand is that people can pretend that these systemic or even policy issues don't affect us at the individual level, and that's not true. We also think that students aren't aware of that. So sometimes, in some ways, it's more insidious impact on their negative well-being because people see things like policies around immigration or deportation, or policies around housing, or policies around health care or mental health care, and think that if it's not individually impacting that person at a particular moment in time, then it's not really relevant to their well-being, and that's not true. People can also have lots of negative things that happen to them vicariously by watching what happens to other people as well.
Exactly, yeah. And even if it's not a direct policy, there's so much rhetoric, so much talk about various areas that you mentioned, immigration, housing, the criminal justice system, and we know that there are disparities in all of these areas in terms of people of color and their ability to either access resources or have the proper resources around them that can help them to flourish. And so just the rhetoric and the talk, even if it's not a direct policy, has that impact, right?
Yeah. Our students is amazing because of all the rhetoric that's going around right now and the current political climate are really impacted on a number of levels. One, I think for graduate students, they're in training and they're working with underserved communities. So what happens in those communities in terms of policies or procedures that are going on currently really impacts their ability to provide services for those children. And then on the other hand, it also impacts the students too. So the students are feeling really helpless about what happens when you have clients, for example, we know that separation anxiety has gone way up in children of color because kids are really afraid of parents being deported. Mm-hmm. So our graduate students who are providing services for these children are worried about, one, how can I effectively work with these kids when in fact there is a reality too. They should be anxious because parents do get deported. And even if it's not your parent, if you hear of a parent or you hear it on the news, that really frightens children. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing for our students is trying to figure out and sort through all these different systems and what level of impact can they make, because in some ways we're not training them per se to deal with public kinds of policies. We're not a policy program, we're a clinical program. So how do we help our students be the most effective? And we have to take a community-based approach, otherwise we feel like we're not really going to make the impact that we could.
Yeah, definitely. And what I'm hearing also is that advocacy is important.
Really important.
Right? And so we kind of train students to advocate for themselves in many ways, right? We can even train students who are becoming clinicians to advocate for their clients in many ways, but we need to be advocating for changes in those policies and procedures and social structures, right, that have that influence on the daily experience of our students. And so taking a broader kind of view of the issue is extremely important.
Right. And I think also we are naive if we don't think that what goes on in these broader contexts doesn't do things like affect students' academic performance. So we see students who are really preoccupied with what's going on in the world at large, wondering if it's a safe space for them. And sometimes our institutions of higher learning behave as though students don't have a context or that they're not embedded within an institution, which is embedded within a community, which is embedded in public policy or a public sphere. And so then they're surprised that students aren't doing as well academically. And I'm like, these students have lots and lots of layers of stress that they're trying to navigate in addition to the regular stress of an academic environment. So it's not surprising that their mental well-being is really suffering.
Definitely. If we think about the neurological functioning and how our cognitive resources are limited. Right? There's a reason that we need to engage in healthy behaviors such as getting adequate sleep, eating healthy meals, exercising or maintaining some kind of physical activity. Those are all so that we can restore our cognitive resources. And so if students of color are charged with not only having to be engaged academically, go to class, learn the material, master the material, but they're also be internalizing or absorbing these threats to their well-being from various constituencies, either our peers or even faculty, but also from the rhetoric or what they're reading in the news or what they're getting on their social media feeds. That's also sapping their resources in an additional way. And so I think that what can be helpful is for us to process those issues with them. I know in some of my classes we spend a good portion of the first part with checking in with the students and finding out what's been impacting them, because I want to make sure that I kind of am able to see where they are so I can understand what they're able to absorb content-wise in the classroom.
Right. Yeah, I teach a class of multicultural psychology, and so the first 5 or 10 minutes of our class, we could kind of talk about current events and how that may or may not impact on how they're doing with their assignments. This last couple of years, it's been really interesting. A lot more anxiety with students in that class, and my abnormal psych class too. A lot more students really worried about this sort of the condition of the world, so to speak. I think the other thing that happens on college campuses is how many professors feel comfortable talking about this with students. So students sometimes feel like there's no safe space for them to talk about this, particularly when there are not faculty of color or people who look like them or from similar communities. And so there's a sense of being an invited guest on a campus, but not being part of the family. And when you're an invited guest, you don't behave the same way you do as when you're family. And so I think as faculty, we have to become more comfortable with having these conversations with students as well.
Definitely. We want to induce that sense of belonging.
Yeah.
Folks often focus on the inclusion, right? It's not good enough just to be included, right? You need to be welcomed. Just with your guest analogy, you don't usually go to a stranger's home and immediately use the restroom without asking permission or get a glass of water without asking permission. And that's what a lot of students of color are feeling in terms of their role and their place on a campus that's not completely welcoming, where they don't feel that sense of belonging, which is critical.
I think the other stress that students of color have too is having to inform or educate the classmates and the faculty about their particular ethnic, racial, or minority group that they're a member of. And there's also intersectionality, so these students may be members of several, have different identities, which may or may not be marginalized as well. And so having to be the token person to speak on behalf of all Jewish people, the token person to speak on behalf of all queer students or African American students is tedious. And so I liked your analogy about the neurocognitive development, because think about it as a finite set of energy, and you're spending energy on stuff that other people don't have to spend energy on. And so there's only so much energy you can place on all of this. And so after a while, your ability to focus on your academic classwork and keep up with things just kind of is real taxing.
Yeah, it's kind of like your cognitive bank is having so many withdrawals,
Right.
and
that's a good analogy.
limited deposits, right? So we need to be depositing more wellness, more validation, right? More affirmations for the students' lives. And when we think about how the institution responds to national incidents or even to critical incidents of bias that occur on campus, if they don't respond, that sends a message
Oh,
of
definitely.
complicity,
Yeah,
of
definitely.
agreement,
Yeah.
even if they don't, but that's how it's interpreted.
I think particularly when incidents occur on campus, there's a sense sometimes that the administration and if it's a student organization involved, become really defensive. So the first response tends to be that you misinterpreted that, or you're being overly sensitive. And that so negates the students of color's experience. And also, sometimes I think you want to say to the person, how can you tell me about what my experience is? You're not me and you're not a member of my group. So you may not know what I'm talking about, and it's fair to say I don't understand, but it's not fair to say that didn't happen or you're being overly sensitive. On our campus at George Washington University, we have from time to time have had incidences occur. And immediately the first response tends to be, that's not us. And I'm kind of like, it is us, right? Because it happened. So it is part of who we are. And having to grapple and acknowledge that we're part of systems that are oppressive, and we may be, unfortunately, have some of these same views and participate in that same oppression, even if we're not actively participating because we don't try to dismantle these systems, then we're implicitly saying that the systems are okay.
Yeah, kind of people perpetuate that fallacy of egalitarianism, of meritocracy, when they don't acknowledge that we are shaped by this system. So inevitably, we're going to enact the biases that the system has taught us to enact,
Yes, yeah.
unless we do a deep introspection of our role, right? And also admit our part, right? And so we all have a part to play in developing whatever solutions are going to be best for our campuses to kind of heal and develop in a more culturally responsive way.
I think one of the challenges, I know in my multicultural psychology class, is getting students to not respond with, I feel really guilty that I'm in a privileged group, because when we have that privilege guilt, it kind of stops there. And so then what happens is the marginalized group tends to spend their time taking care of the person in privilege and making them feel better. And so I kind of say, so let's all agree that we're all members of a privileged group, and let's all agree that most of us are probably members of a marginalized group, and move from there. And that the response and the answer to that problem, to that question, is not to feel guilty, because that doesn't do anything. And so you can feel bad about it, but then what are you going to do? So we need some action behind that. And the guilt doesn't really spur action.
No. And that additional emotional labor of caretaking the people who might be aggressors is another layer of
privilege, right?
Privilege, right?
Yeah.
That is being enacted, and that's also, again, sapping those very limited and precious cognitive resources. So again, a deterrent to that student being able to do what their job is on that college campus, which is go to class and learn the material and graduate. Right? And so that probably adds to those educational disparities that we often see that students of color and other marginalized students on campuses have. So we mentioned a microaggression earlier, so I think I want to briefly define what microaggressions are.
Okay.
So microaggressions are the brief and commonplace verbal, behavioral, and environmental dignities that are directed towards marginalized people. They often happen in a very subtle, covert way, often at the sort of subconscious level of awareness from both the person who's enacting it and also the receiver. Right? The receiver might feel that something is wrong or something is funky in this interaction, might not even be able to pinpoint what it is, but they know something is wrong. The antenna go up. They're often unintentional, right? And so this idea between this intention idea is important to kind of tease apart. A lot of folks will respond whenever they are called out for committing a microaggression that I didn't intend that, and that kind of absolves them then of the harm that was created. And so with the microaggression framework, we focus more on the harm as opposed to the intention. And I like using the analogy of the law. and how there are laws for unintentional acts of violence, right? We call that manslaughter.
Manslaughter, right.
Right? But in the bias world, there aren't really any rules or laws that protect these unintentional acts of bias, right? So I think it's important that we kind of tease that apart and we sort of steer away from having an intention conversation and more having an impact conversation.
I think that microaggressions in some ways, and research kind of bears this out, are more difficult to deal with because they're subtle. And so the recipient of that has to kind of think through for a minute, what did you say? Was that an insult? And not always being sure. And again, that takes more mental energy to do that. I was in a situation once where I was lost and I was trying to get through a community and I kept making stops to ask for directions. And people would not open their doors. They rolled up their windows. And this went on for about an hour. So I finally got to the place I was trying to go to. And I had called them and said before, I'm really lost. I'm just trying to get to my destination. And so they said, well, ask for directions. And I said, I have, but people keep not responding or kind of blocking me out. And the person said to me, oh, that wouldn't happen in Northern Virginia. So I said to her, when I get there, if I get there today, I will be the angry black woman who will be angry with you because you're negating my experience. And I think that happens a lot with microaggressions, is that people can easily, as you said earlier, with denying with the intention. And the story I have about that is I used to have a dog who was incontinent, and she would urinate all over my floor. And she didn't mean to do that, but my floor was still ruined.
Right.
So I think the intention is not the issue. And also, you need to ask the person who is the recipient of that microaggression, how they get to define whether or not it was harmful, not the person who perpetrated it, because it's the person who's marginalized. Exactly. It's their experience.
Exactly. Kind of goes back to this privilege of who has the power to define reality, right? And the privilege in society often creates the rules that everyone has to live under, and so already has a lot of power in defining that reality. And so when somebody says that, oh, I didn't intend that, or you're overreacting, right? That's them projecting a reality onto you that doesn't map onto you, and so it's another form of microaggression.
Or being dismissive, like, oh, I didn't mean that, or whatever. Sometimes I wonder, and I know my students and my own children ask me this a lot, is every time you're the recipient of a microaggression, should you challenge it? Because it can get exhausting. And how do you decide when should you say something about it? When you get people making comments like, wow, that was a good talk, that you're so articulate. And I think to myself, all of us have 9,000 degrees, so why would we not be articulate? Or you're really attractive for whatever group you're a member of, as if there's some question about the physical attractiveness of my group as a whole. How many times should you respond to something like that, and when should you let it go?
Yeah, this being the exception to the rule, right? People are thinking that it's a compliment. But what they're really saying is that I didn't expect someone that looks like you to speak like that or to look like this. And so now I need to communicate this to you because I'm having this reaction now. And they forget the step of, well, where is this reaction coming from?
Right.
Yeah. And so I think people need to kind of step back, do some introspective work, and think a bit before they kind of speak or make a judgment that they even think it's a compliment. These are often backhanded compliments.
Yes, yeah. I think the other struggle that the majority community has to really deal with is kind of recognizing that on some level everyone has privilege, and on some level it would be really difficult to live in this country and not internalize some of the quote-unquote isms, because I think that goes a long way into really checking yourself before you open your mouth. When my kids were little, I used to tell them every thought in your head shouldn't come out your mouth. And so trying to think and process better from the other person's perspective how what you're about to say could come across. I think in our communities we do a lot of what's called othering, where we kind of separate people out from ourselves in ways which are really insidious and harmful, and not really recognizing that we do that. So I think a first step really is to acknowledge and own that, and that growing up in this community, in this public sphere really, is really hard for people not to do that. So make the assumption that you might do that, and then think through before you say things.
You just made me think of the concept of cultural humility, and I love how it's kind of being embraced by the cultural competency folks as a way of being, right? And so in cultural humility, we never assume that the other person has any kind of a similar framework or understanding of the world that we do.
Right.
And if you just think about the therapy relationship, starting out a conversation about what does therapy mean to you, to the client? What does healing mean to the client? Because that's likely going to differ than my perspective that has been, quite honestly, influenced by Western psychology a lot, because that's where my training was grounded in most of our trainings, right? And so it's good to kind of think, what is the other person's perspective? How does that differ from me? Always checking my assumption about my ideals and how they may be inaccurately or ineffectively or inappropriately directed on somebody else's experience. Again, dictating their reality instead of letting them have the self-determination to convey their reality to me.
I think this is what you're talking about is so important, because people will sometimes say that's a therapeutic relationship, but really you can do that in all your relationships, not make assumptions.
You can.
Asking, I know for my students are often asking me, well, how will I know I'm not offending someone? I'm like, ask them, or ask people how they would want to be addressed. For example, I know a big issue right now is what pronouns that we use, and people are flubbing and getting anxious about that. I'm like, why don't you just ask the person, what pronouns do you prefer? And that way you don't have to guess or feel guilty or assume anything. You can just ask people what you want to know. And the asking questions for most people is not offensive. It's actually, some people are refreshingly surprised and feel respected that you care about their perspective and that you're not assuming that you all have the same perspective.
Yeah, you care about me so much that you want to learn more about me, right?
Yeah.
And so it's important also to think about when we're asking questions, is that to fulfill some kind of curiosity of mine, or is that to actually help me to see you as a person for who you are, what your cultural background brings, and what your worldview brings to our relationship?
I think that brings up a really good point too. Sometimes when people are from multicultural backgrounds and it's not really clear to someone else what group membership they obtain, and people say, "What are you?" or where are you from? To be sensitive about that too. I think the motive behind the questions, because part of that is treating people like they're an exotic animal in a zoo, so to speak, and also, why do you need to know?
Right.
So respecting people's space and boundaries as well.
Yeah. And also believing some of the first answers you hear, that "where are you from" is a common microaggression question. By itself, it's not a microaggression. It's how it's used. So if I were to ask you where you're from and you give me the answer, and I ask you, where are you really from?
Right.
That's when it becomes a microaggression.
Right.
Because I'm questioning that first answer, right? And my assumption about where I think you're from is coming out via that second, "where are you really from?" Because I already have an idea, right? That's probably misinformed.
Or just even when people say I'm an American, and we're always thinking, what does that mean? Because what most people mean by that is a white male. And so what happens to the people who are not a member of that particular group, who are also Americans? And so I think we need a lot of work on terms that we kind of toss out or throw away very easily without realizing that they're actually loaded.
They're very loaded, yeah. So let's talk about some of the impact that these micro and macroaggressions have on students of color, especially their well-being.
So I think at the macro level, as I said earlier, I think we need to really be understanding that that policies and things that go on in the community really do impact students very negatively. It makes students feel unsafe. The rhetoric we have currently in our political, sociocultural system makes students feel really unsafe. Students are wondering if they can complete their education safely here. It makes students make different kinds of choices of what colleges they will and won't go to. Even as a parent of 3 children who went to college, I was very cautious and encouraging my children to be cautious about the broader community. So I think people assume that when young people pick a college, that they're only picking it for the academic prowess or maybe a sports institution or something in the arts. But as a parent, I'm going to tell you that's not the only thing we're thinking about. We're also thinking about who's in the community around you, how safe is it, is there a community of color or whatever your group is, are they nearby? Is there a vibrant queer community there, for example? Are people going to be ostracized because they're in the queer community? So all of that's going through your mind. And while your primary goal is to get an education, the context in which you're getting that education is also critical. So I think that's really important. And I think that we forget, in a way, for me as a parent anyway, you just don't sell the school, you have to sell the town around it.
Exactly.
Otherwise, I'm really worried about that. I think at the graduate level, if you're working with, you want to work or learn about certain communities, that becomes really critical too. Well, you have access to that community. If you're living in a rural community which has very few people of color, and you're training to be a clinician or a counseling psychologist, will you be able to actually find people to work with? So I think that's a really important issue.
I definitely agree. Yeah, the community that the institution is embedded in is definitely going to have an impact on those norms that institution then actualizes, right? And so some institutions might have a greater opportunity for microaggressions to actually occur, depending on the community that they're embedded in and those messages that are filtering through. And I think about some of those direct impacts on mental health and well-being. I review a lot of microaggression studies, many that are not published because there's just so many coming through. Every study that I've reviewed, even the unpublished ones, every study has a direct correlation between the amount of microaggressions the person is experiencing and whatever that outcome is that's being measured.
Right.
So if it's a well-being outcome such as depression or anxiety or some other type of mental health compromise, managing stress, it even filters into to impacting help-seeking behaviors. So the more microaggressions that somebody experiences in their educational context, the less likely they are to seek help from that context, which makes sense.
Right.
Why are you going to seek help from something you think is threatening you already?
Right. And I think that for institutions need to appreciate, though, that that's why it's really important to respond to micro and macroaggressions immediately,
Yes,
publicly, so that I think there's a lot of issues around PR for institutions of higher learning and worrying about if we address this directly and openly, that we'll be perceived as being racist or sexist or heterosexist. But from the perspective of the person who's marginalized, not addressing it openly means it's a well-kept secret. And we know the secrets are always destructive anyway.
Yes.
So that means we can't really talk about it. And as you said earlier, it's not a safe place to talk about this.
Right.
And then who am I going to? So all that gets internalized, which really creates more stress, more anxiety, more problems with depression, et cetera.
Definitely. Yeah, students need to know they can go someplace to report these things. There are laws that protect people based on certain classes, but those laws often don't include microaggressions as one of those forms of bias that is actually protected or that you can actually use to sue the institution if you need to, but
Right.
to advocate for whatever resources you need. And so institutions need to implement bias response systems that also include microaggressions and that are in areas that students of color or queer students or women or students with disabilities or students from low-income first-gen backgrounds naturally kind of filter or go to, so they can then report these things in a manner where they feel they're going to be heard, number one,
Right, yeah.
but where the institution can then hear what the students are experiencing, so the institution can have an accurate depiction of that lived experience.
Right. I know recently on college campuses, people are dealing a lot with buildings that were named after people who were have had colored or checkered past around racial issues predominantly. And the decisions to change names or not change names, which is really, really difficult. But again, imagine going into a building every day with with classes that's named after a person who enslaved your people. And the message that sends every day
Right.
that who I am and my history and my ancestry is not important and is not valued here. And I was sharing with my students sometimes we always demand that the person who's marginalized make the difference. And it's kind of like the analogy, which is a horrible analogy but very poignant, is it's like teaching people who are members of a group who will be lynched to run faster. And like that's true, that would work probably better for you, but why don't we change the persons who are doing the lynching? And in this case, why don't we change the institutions? And it's really insensitive to continue to have statues and names of building around people who really maybe did some great things in their life, but in addition to the great things that they did, they also really perpetuated oppressing others. And that group of people is represented on this campus. And there are so many other people that you could name statues after and display and name buildings after who haven't done that.
Definitely. Right. Those great things came at the cost of
A heavy cost,
whole groups
yeah,
of people.
yeah.
Right. At a variety of levels, including death. Right. And so what you're talking about are these environmental manifestations of microaggressions and macroaggressions, and I consider those to be some of the most insidious because you don't need somebody to enact that for you. Just traversing an environment is all you need for those microaggressions to have an impact on you.
I think they're worse too, though, because I think you spend more mental energy figuring them out. And I know my youngest daughter was in a school, which I won't name, and she was doing well in the class, and one of her classmates said to her, they were talking about she was doing well, and they said, oh, you know, DR is doing well in this class, and the rest of us are failing. And the person said, oh, is she black smart or is she just smart? And even when she confronted that person, the person had no clue that that was an offensive thing to say. And I'm not sure if we would call that a macro or microaggression, but I thought the amount of energy that she spent thinking about that, should I confront the person, yes or no? After she did confront the person's response bothered her even more because they were not apologetic. That whole incident took up a couple of weeks of her time, thinking about it, talking about, you know, whereas I used to say to her, you're just here to go to school. You know, you're not here to educate people about how they should respond to you. And so that's why I think it's more insidious. It's that you think about it, you have to wonder, question it.
It stays with you.
It stays with you in ways that macroaggressions, at least you're not trying to figure out if it's racist or sexist or heterosexist. It's kind of obvious to you that it is. And then you can respond accordingly, but at least you're not wondering. You're not spending mental energy wondering about what this is.
Exactly. Yeah, they stay with you. And it's the accumulation of these microaggressions that then lead to these compromises that we're all trying to figure out solutions to address.
I agree. I agree.
Well, this is bringing us to the end of our conversation. This is very informative. I learned a lot from speaking with you for the last half hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. And so thank you all for joining us today. I invite you to visit stefund.org, where you can find webinars and other resources such as this. And you can also learn more about the Equity and Mental Health Framework, which was developed by the Steve Fund in collaboration with the Jed Foundation, which produced a set of 10 recommendations and implementation strategies that institutions can use to overtly address issues that impact the well-being of students of color. I also invite you to join the Steve Fund family as we continue to work on developing solutions and highlighting issues that impact the well-being of students of color. Thank you.